Order, order. Rebecca Smith to move the motion.
I'd like to move that this House has considered government support for children in adoptive and kinship placements. Thank you, Ms Harris. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. Thank you to so many people being in the room as well. I'm going to keep my speech as short as possible so you can all get in, but bear with me. Children who are no longer able to live with their birth parents are the responsibility of us all. Speaking up for them and their families is something I committed to do before my election, and it is a privilege to be here to do just that today. We are primarily here today, though, to talk about those who are fortunate enough to have a permanent placement through adoption or a secure long-term arrangement with a special guardianship or child arrangement order, in other words, kinship care. However, we know that the average amount of time that a young person or child spends in care before they are adopted is 15 months, and that this often involves multiple placements. We also know that around 80% of these children may have experienced neglect, abuse or violence before their adoption. The Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund was set up in response to these realities, and that is why the recent uncertainty and limitations that have been placed on it have been so concerning and have resulted in this debate. Over recent weeks, the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund has been raised a number of times in Parliament. First, when we were waiting for news about the fund for 2025-26 after damaging delays, and then several times since the government announced it would continue funding the scheme, albeit with significant rule changes. And I know honourable members from across the House, many of whom are here today, have, like me, been raising the issues, speaking out and seeking opportunities to raise the future of ASGSF in detail. I will.
Thank you very much, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for securing this incredibly important debate. One of the other things I think many of us have been doing is talking to special guardians in our constituency, and in Hartlepool I certainly have. One of their huge concerns is that the cut to this fund will dissuade people from taking on these incredibly important roles in the future and actually result in costs popping up elsewhere in the public state and end up costing us more in the future. Is that something that you would agree with?
Rebecca Smith.
The honourable gentleman takes the words right out of my mouth, and if he stays for the whole debate, he will hear me say exactly that. He raises a very important point. We are asking people to care for the most vulnerable children, and if we don't give them the tools to do that, they won't apply in the first place. So I am pleased to have been granted this debate today to shine a further light on the issue, highlight how the government's recent position is a false economy, and put further pressure on the government to do the right thing and reverse their recent changes. Without access to the previous level of support offered through the fund, there is a very real concern that the number of adopters will fall and more children, those with some of the most difficult and challenging stories, will face the long term in care, seeing their future massively impacted as a result. Before I progress, I want to pay tribute to the thousands of parents and guardians and carers right across the country who have been fighting for the children and young people in their care, those who are unable to live with their birth parents. Especially to the families in my constituency in South West Devon, some of whom I have met and those who have written to me to share their experiences, and all of who are rightly incredibly worried about the impact of the cuts to the support they've previously received. It is a privilege to be here to speak on your behalf. Also, I want to place on record my thanks to the charities who have been campaigning against the recent changes to support children in adoptive and kinship placements. Adoption UK, Quorum, Kinship, Family Rights Group and CVAA, to mention a few, and to local adoption agencies like Adopt South West, who serve families in my constituency and others in Devon and Cornwall. Your work has been especially powerful over the last couple of months as you have shared information with us and we've fought together. So turning again, Madam Chair, to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. This fund was set up under the Conservative government in 2015 as a result of the 2014 Children and Families Act. It was designed to help the families access specialist therapy services that they may need. Since the Adoption and Children Act 2002, adoptive families have had a right to the assessment of their adoption support needs from their local authority. However, the 2014 Act brought in a number of further measures to support adoptive families, including this fund. In 2023, the fund was expanded to include kinship care, enabling some children with special guardianship or child arrangement orders to qualify for support too. A solid legacy to work from. However, since July 2024, there was a cloud of uncertainty about the future of the fund. The Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, a lifeline to thousands of vulnerable children, was left hanging in the balance. Families were left wondering whether the therapeutic support their children desperately need would vanish overnight. In April, the Department for Education announced significant cuts to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. The annual therapy funding per child has been slashed from £5,000 to £3,000. The separate £2,500 allowance for specialist assessments, that's gone. Match funding to support the most complex cases, gone. And the ability to carry support across financial years, also gone. A shocking 40% reduction in funding for support that we all know is highly specialised and comes at a cost as a result. I will.
For securing this important debate. I agree 100% with the point that she's outlining. Two constituents in West Dorset support two children with multiple needs, overlapping autism, ADHD, significant trauma, as you mentioned. The funding for a one-off assessment remains, but the ongoing funding to support those children no longer exists, and that's got to be a fundamental problem.
Rebecca Smith.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the goalposts have been completely shifted, and a bit like we've seen in farming debates recently, it happened overnight as well, and so there was no warning, no ability for families to come up with some other ideas as well.
Will you give way?
I will. Well, sorry.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I thank her for bringing forward this debate. Following the announcements in April, a constituent got in touch, and she has two adopted granddaughters who rely on specialist support given their traumatic start in life. Does she share, the honourable member, does she share my concerns that diminishing this support fund is going to have long-term financial impacts, both on the government's forthcoming budget? Thank you.
Rebecca Smith.
I agree with the honourable member. There is definitely a concern around that, and again, I will touch on that a little bit later, and it's already been brought up as well this afternoon. Turning to some of what my constituents have said, if I may, Madam Chair, I will speed up. My constituent CA said, these children are slipping through the net and it is the parents who are dealing with the fallout. Excessive child-on-parent violence, total exhaustion from managing needs at home and constant battling with professionals. I myself have had to give up my career, incidentally she was a teacher, in order to maintain the daily battle of getting her to school, then constant meetings to get her any sort of education that meets her needs. It's exhausting. Joanne said, myself and my husband adopted our daughter 12 years ago and our son 6 years ago. They both have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder alongside autism spectrum disorder. My son is 6 years old, and because of the trauma he endured in utero, he also has complex needs and has suicidal ideation with intent and wishes he had never been born. We were lucky enough to secure vital match funding last year to enable the sensory OT to have weekly sessions to support him in controlling his motions and to create a specific sensory diet which school will be able to use to support him in accessing school and supporting his needs. To hear that the fund is being reduced to £3,000 is truly terrifying. As a family, we have been in crisis and at risk of family placement breakdown, as having two complex children is exhausting physically, mentally and emotionally, and my husband and myself had nothing left in the tank to carry on. I have been able to work for 6 years due to my daughter being unable to access education as her needs were not understood or being met. The Labour government promised to be different, to be bold, to put children first, but when it came to one of the most vulnerable groups in our society, children who've experienced trauma, neglect and loss, they hesitated, they wavered, and they failed to provide the leadership we were told to expect. The government say the changes have been made to maximise the number of children supported, but how can they claim to support more children by offering them less? How can they ask families to step up and adopt or become guardians only to pull the rug out from under them when they need the most support? Nearly 20,000 children received support through this fund last year. That's 20,000 stories of resilience, of families holding on through the hardest times. And now many of those families are being told, you're on your own. As another constituent wrote, I'm in the final months of a doctorate to become a clinical psychologist, and much of my work is with families who rely on this fund. Children and young people who are adopted have almost all experienced developmental trauma and are left with many relational and neurodevelopmental complexities that require long-term specialist support and intervention in order to heal. Parenting these children is usually not straightforward and can be incredibly challenging and draining, requiring specialist support. I have little doubt that with the reduction of the fund, we will see a significant increase in adoption breakdowns. This is not only incredibly traumatic for all involved, but is also incredibly expensive, far greater than the costs that will be saved through the reduction in the support fund. The cost of keeping a child in care has been estimated at around £280,000, significantly more than the £2,000 that has been cut. And we know that this is not the only cost that will increase. As well as the risk of returning to care, adopted young people face tougher educational and employment outcomes, and their mental health and well-being is significantly impacted, especially as they transition to adulthood. We have just had the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill progress through the Commons. Why undermine the aims within that by severely limiting the support in the ASGSF? What has become clear throughout the last few months is that this shouldn't be a binary decision. It should not be about spreading funding thinly to go further. It should be about extending the funding at its previous levels, to see a return to the £5,000 fair access limit, to reinstate the £2,500 allowance for specialist assessments, to allow for match funding, to make the funding permanent and not subject to annual spending rounds, and to seek to provide it for more families. And to recognise that if this money is not provided in this ring-fenced way by government, it will fall onto local authorities to find the money, and we know how that tends to end up. With one final quote, if I may, Madam Chair. To conclude, the voice of one final constituent, another professional working in this field, raises some serious questions which perhaps I hope the Minister can address. She says there has been no consultation process at all. How can this be fair or legal as adoptive and kinship families have access to therapies in their adoption and special guardianship order paperwork and in their EHCP agreements? Who will adopt disabled children where lots of intervention and support is necessary? How many children will return to care? What will families do without multidisciplinary assessments, where it is beyond negligence to take this away, as it is often the only thing that triggers considered recommendations for adopted children in EHCPs for case reviews for providing carefully managed intervention plans? Our previously looked after children are being discriminated against due to their complex needs, where families face yet another closed doors. So I call on the Minister to reverse her decision and to acknowledge that the risk of not doing so opens up an uncertain future for these special children, young people and their families.
I am very concerned that there are a lot more members present than there are actually on the speaking list. So if you have not put in to speak, then it's unlikely you will be called. I intend to start the front bench speaks at 15:28. So therefore, I'm allowing you 3 minutes to give time for the front bench. The question is that this House has considered government support for children in adoptive and kinship placements. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Chair. And it's a pleasure to serve with you in the Chair today. And I also congratulate the Honourable Member for today's speech. This is difficult because I know that the Minister, because of her professional background, knows everything we're going to say to her today. I know that the Minister deeply cares about this issue. In fact, I know that the Minister will do everything she possibly can to ensure that children who have got care experience, whether that is through a special guardianship order or have been adopted, will get the holistic support that they need. I know that the Minister wants every child to have the therapeutic interventions which make a difference to their life course and their future. I know that the Minister understands the importance of this fund and the transformational difference it makes not only to children but their families, to siblings, to parents and of course to the environment they're in. I know that the Minister understands that the life course of these children will be different if they don't have the vital intervention as early as possible. And I know that the Minister understands the issues associated with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, with trauma, with abuse, with violence and neglect. And I know that the Minister deeply cares about this issue. And yet we had the cliff edge that came forward between the last fund and this fund. And it was only the 11th hour, in fact, it was gone midnight before we saw the confirmation that the fund would continue. But it wasn't until 2 weeks later that we learnt that the fund had been slashed by 40%. And therefore the outcomes of these young people will be deeply affected. Drilling into the data, it says that the average amount spent on therapeutic support for a family was £3,335 last year. That's the average. So many need more. And as a result of this, not even the average will be reached. And of course, those specialist assessments won't be there. And it would be fine if we had these services in our public sector available, and I would welcome that. But we simply don't. These families need vital access. So I put it to the Minister that she stamps her feet at Treasury's door, that she demands that the Treasury don't play games like they did this morning in Treasury's questions, but actually deliver this money, because it will cost the Treasury far more if they don't bring forward this money. But also address the big challenge that we're seeing, the fact that the number of children in our country in care is rising. And that is where the solution is, getting that early help in to make the real difference. I'm proud that my city is reducing the number of children who are care experienced, but we need to see this fund restored first.
Carol Voden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate my neighbour, the member for South West Devon, on securing this debate and her excellent speech. We know that adopted children are often the most traumatised in our society. The abuse, neglect and instability they've endured in their earliest years leave lasting scars, affecting their development, their ability to trust and their mental health. But with the right support, these children can heal. Therapy gives them a second chance to feel safe, to build meaningful relationships and lead stable, loving lives. Let's take Leo, for example, an 8-year-old boy who lost his parents and 2 siblings and now lives with his special guardian under a special guardianship order due to his assessed psychological need for permanence. Leo also has a diagnosis of autism spectrum condition and has experienced complex trauma within his birth home during the first few years of his life. Thanks to the fund, support from the fund, Leo and his special guardian mum have been accessing specialist psychotherapy. The progress he has made has been remarkable. He is now able to share his sadness and ask for comfort when he feels overwhelmed, a huge step for a child who used to shut down completely and express distress through challenging behaviour. Leo's case highlights why early therapeutic intervention is so crucial. However, due to recent cuts and delays in the ASGSF funding, Leo has been waiting 5 months to continue his therapy. Critical work focused on processing the complex grief of losing his entire birth family. The interruption in therapy is more than just a pause. It risks undoing much of the progress Leo has made. Rebuilding trust with his therapist will take time, and the delay may trigger deep feelings of abandonment, undermining his already fragile belief that adults can be safe and consistent. Even when therapy resumes, the reduced number of sessions now available is unlikely to be enough to fully support Leo through his grief. A child like Leo doesn't need a quick fix. He needs time, skilled support and consistency to help him heal. I will give way.
Sarah.
Giving way, she talks of a heartwarming story of her constituent. 2 constituents in my constituency, Glastonbury and Somerton, Liz and Steve from Wincanton, have recently become the special guardians for their grandchild. They faced a long drawn-out process as a result of the delays to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, and they've really struggled to get the support that they need. So does my honourable friend agree with me that the government should urgently reverse these harmful cuts and reaffirm its commitment to supporting vulnerable children?
Caroline Voden.
I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and yes, I absolutely do agree. When children like Leo receive the right early help, they are more likely to thrive in school, avoid crisis services and grow into adults who contribute positively to society. Supporting these children gives them a second chance at life and ultimately it also saves money. This is why the fund was created in 2015. Early therapeutic intervention can be transformative and much more cost-effective than dealing with complex problems later in life. Demand is growing. In 2023, 38% of families reported reaching a crisis point, up from 30% in 2022. Yet therapists fear that recent funding changes will actually reduce the number of children they can support. Some are already leaving the field. Families are growing wary, hesitant to invest in assessments, worrying that they won't have enough left for therapy or that funding will run out entirely. I have met with one therapist who says she will be able to see fewer children, not more, because of the reduction in funding. Quality of care is also at risk. Limited budgets may push families toward cheaper providers who lack the specialist expertise needed to work safely with these traumatised children. Also, many effective therapeutic models just cannot be delivered within the reduced budgets and fewer sessions. The long-term costs of underfunding are enormous. Without proper support, these placements may break down, forcing these vulnerable children back into a care system. We cannot let this happen. Restoring sustainable ASGSF funding is essential. Every child like Leo deserves the chance to heal, and that starts with the right support at the right time. Thank you.
Graham Morris.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Harris. And I would also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for South West Devon on securing this important debate. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to raise concerns on behalf of my constituents in County Durham. Kinship carers play a crucial role in our communities. They step up to care for children when their parents are no longer able to do so, often under very challenging circumstances. Their care allows children to remain within their families and support networks, which we know leads to better outcomes in adulthood. Yet, despite their vital contribution, government support remains unequal. The two-tier system persists, where access to help is based not upon a child's needs, but on how they entered kinship care. This must change. For example, only kinship children who have previously been looked after by the local authority can access Pupil Premium Plus, priority school admissions, support from the designated teacher, and the adoption and special guardianship support funds. This should not be the case, Ms Harris, and is simply unfair. That's one of the reasons why I support Kinship Charities' Value Our Love campaign, which calls for the government to join up this fragmented system and guarantee access to support, no matter which route is followed into kinship care. Emotional and behavioural challenges are the main reasons kinship carers fear they cannot continue to care for their loved ones. These children, often shaped by trauma and loss, need early, high-quality therapeutic support to heal, support that must be protected and not cut. I welcome the government's commitment to a trial of £40 million kinship allowance in 10 local authorities, but we urgently need clarity. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm when decisions will be made and whether County Durham will be included. I understand there are 317 local authorities who are vying to be a pilot authority. And indeed, in East Durham alone, there are 340 kinship families, some of whom are known to me, and face ongoing financial uncertainty and reduced access to support. This limited pilot risks leaving many behind. And I would say the comprehensive spending review is the ideal opportunity to accelerate plans for kinship carers. And I would urge the Minister and the Government to commit to a non-means tested allowance at least equal to the national minimum foster rate and to ending the current two-tier system. Carers do save the state £4.3 billion annually. Every child matters and deserves the same chance to thrive, no matter their circumstances.
Jim Shannon.
Pleasure to serve under your chairship, and can I thank the Honourable Member for South West Devon for leading the debate on this issue, and the crowd is here indicates that an issue is very, very important, so thank you for doing that. Adoptive and kinship care is a wonderful thing to offer children a safe and caring environment to grow up, but there's no doubt that it does have challenges which need to be addressed, and more so supported by government, and it's great to be here today to talk about that. To give an understanding of the topic, Madam Chair, in Northern Ireland there's an estimate between 8,000 and 10,000 children living in formal and kinship care, and the number of children living with friends and family is consistently increasing. As of March 24, there are some 4,000 children in the care of local authorities, but in the year of 2023 were adopted out of care, highlighting how there still is many more children in care than being adopted. In addition, Northern Ireland seems to have the highest rate of kinship care along with Scotland, so there is no doubt that more should be done, needs to be done to take on the care of relatives. happy to, yeah.
You mentioned the challenges that
Julie
kinship
Menz.
carers face, and I think one of those is the legal complexity of the current system. I had a constituent come recently. She's had an SGO in place for her grandson, where she's the kinship carer. But on her diagnosis with lung disease, she went to see whether it was possible to add her son, the uncle of her grandson, to that agreement. She was told legally that wasn't possible, but thankfully, thanks to advice from the Family Rights Group, it is possible. But does he agree with me that more needs to be done to simplify the legal processes that surround kinship care?
Jim Shannon.
Thank you for that, and she's absolutely right, because it's frustrating to have a legalistic system that seems to be trying to hold the thing up, the process, whenever you're looking for the goodness and a way forward for the child, and that's really important, so thank you, Honourable Lady, for that. In October 2024, the Government announced it would provide some £40 million to trial a new kinship allowance for some 10 local authorities in England. The aims to test whether paying some form of allowance to kinship care could encourage more people to take a family in when needed. Government has said that this will start in autumn of this year. Often finance is a block in many ways, and for relatives that already have children of their own, often we will find that most simply cannot afford to take on the care. So I would ask the Minister a question, if you don't mind asking it, please. It's in relation, if the Minister would, along with Government and with those who have the purse strings, would you consider extending funding for trials in the likes of Northern Ireland and Scotland, where the figures surrounding children living with families are higher? I think you get a better perspective of a trial there, and those two places, if you don't mind me saying that. And there are many reasons why a family may choose to adopt. Post-adoption support is paramount, and I have no doubt with specialist assistance long term, this is where relationships can thrive. Access to therapeutic services for children is incredibly important to support the child's emotional and mental well-being. For example, in education, I find this of major importance. Children will naturally talk about and discuss family environments, their parents, their grandparents, and for so many young people who do not have the same environment, it can become uncomfortable for them in schools. Whilst we have fantastic pastoral support in schools, perhaps it's not a bad idea for outside specialists to engage with kids in school to ensure they have specific support that they need. Statutory adoption pay is paid at 90% of earnings for the first 6 weeks, and also for a further lower of £187.18 per week for the next 33 weeks. Perhaps, Madam Chair, kinship payments also could be looked at for those relatives who take on care from birth, so they're not left behind in terms of supporting young children and giving them the best start. To conclude, Madam Chair, the sacrifice adoptive and kinship care makes to the lives of young people is incredibly wonderful. And there are so many people out there who make this decision for the betterment of a young person having the opportunity to grow up. Government support for them must be unwavering so that they don't struggle and have access to sufficient finance and well-being support. For children too, having access to long-term assistance will allow them to thrive. And what more can we ask for through this debate, other than for their bright futures? Thank you.
Chris Blow.
To speak, Madam Chair. I apologise, I'm just down to intervene.
You're on the list.
Listen, who am I to argue with you in the
Your
chair?
office has obviously indicated do you wish to speak?
I'll just briefly say what I was going to say. I think this issue is one of the few that, since I came to this House in July, that has cut cross-party across everybody in the sense of what they see that this fund does on the ground, whether it's in their county councils and their district councils. It's one of those issues that we see people at our constituency surgeries and see the impact that it makes on those families and supporting those children. And one of the biggest concerns I've had throughout this process, and I must pay tribute to the Minister in her place, who has been, quite frankly, very patient with the many comments that I've put forward to her and been very supportive in getting me answers, is that I have big concerns about the impacts this will have on encouraging future kinship carers to come forward if they feel the financial impacts on them mean they won't be able to support those children that they desperately want to support. And listen, many of us in this room have been councillors and we see the impacts on local government finances. We know that if government doesn't step up or change course on this issue, local government simply won't be able to step in and take their place. And you know, this government, and I'm proud to be part of it, talks a lot about social value. I'm frustrated the previous government didn't talk about social value as much as it should have, but social value of our decision making. This to me is an issue where social value is so evidently important in making financial decisions. Not just the price to government about future interventions, whether that be, God forbid, in police or crime or in education, but the impact that it's going to make directly to the life chances of those children involved. And I took my responsibility as a corporate parent very, very seriously when I was a county councillor. I often got very frustrated when politics got in the way of making good decisions about children's services and supporting children in Worcestershire. I think this is an issue that we can't afford not to take better financial decisions on this. This certainly will cost us more money down in the future. And quite frankly, having met some of the children supported in my constituency in the last few weeks by this fund, we're missing out on some of the brightest young people I've met who've gone through incredibly difficult times, who will make incredible contributions to society moving forward. And I just think on this issue, I'm more than happy to grab my pitchfork and support the Minister in running to the Treasury. This is just something that we can't afford not to change. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I apologise for the confusion.
Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Member for South West Devon for securing today's important and timely debate. And as a member of the APPG on kinship care, I'd like to focus on how vital kinship carers are, yet how often they are overlooked and under-supported, because often they don't even identify as kinship carers. They're the ones providing stability, safety and love to children who can no longer live with their birth parents, such as grandparents, aunts and uncles or family friends. But they do that for the love of those children and quite often the families that they can no longer be with. And they need proper support to avoid these arrangements from fundamentally breaking down. In a 2024 survey, 35% of kinship carers rated the information they received from their local authority as very poor, and 44% said they did not trust their local authority at all. These people are exhausted, forced to battle a system that should be supporting them. They're also often navigating complex traumas on top of a failing SEND system, with half of children in kinship care also not getting the help they need in their education setting, and then families facing a cliff edge of support when the young person then turns 18. That's why the Adoption and Special Guardianship Fund is so crucial for providing those bespoke therapies that those children and their trusted adults rely on, a pot that kinship carers have only been able to access since 2023. In my own constituency of Chichester, we're lucky to have Beacon House. They are a truly outstanding therapeutic service for young people, families and adults. And I'd like to share some of the comments from the children who've had support at Beacon House. It has helped me to understand why I sometimes act the way I do in scenarios and to unload my day-to-day worries that perhaps were taking a toll on my mental health. And it's made me feel safer. It doesn't make me feel like I'm not welcome here. It has helped me to think about why I do things and help to understand, and for my parents to understand too. For so many of the families using Beacon House and services like them, the Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund has been a lifeline which benefited over 18,000 children throughout the UK last year. And I believe that the government does know that this fund is vital for families up and down the UK, and I can understand their desire to increase the availability of it for more families that would benefit. But this fund is preventing breakdowns in adoptions and special guardianship arrangements. So my question to the Minister today is, will she make the argument to the Treasury that increasing the fund so all children under care arrangements can access this support, but with proper clinical assessments funded, so the support can be a tailored approach? Because these families do extraordinary things. They step in, often at a moment's notice, and they give those vulnerable children a future. The least we can do is give them the support that they deserve.
Alistair Strachan.
Thank you, Ms Harris. It's under your chairship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for South West Devon for securing, I think, what we'd all acknowledge should be a really important debate. Like I think a lot of people in the chamber today, one of my biggest privileges before coming to this place was serving as a corporate parent on the local authority where I lived at the time. Now, while corporate parent can often feel quite a stale and bureaucratic term, it's actually one of the most deeply important and human parts of a councillor's role, making sure you are therefore championing and supporting every young person who, for whatever reason, whatever has happened to them in their life, now finds themselves in your local authority's care. There is nothing more moving or devastating sometimes than speaking to some of those young people. The inspiring resilience they've shown in the face of some traumas that lots of people here would never have to even contemplate happening to themselves, but also knowing the very real ways in which the current system is continuing to let them down and fail them. Despite the fact that we know that kinship placements, strong, supportive fostering placements and adoptive placements are by far and away associated with the best outcomes for young people in care, with the best support for them to make that best start in life to go on and thrive later down the line, far too often the system isn't set up to facilitate that. Young people often end up at great cost to all of us and to our local authorities in unproductive and sometimes quite deeply cold private placements. Now, when coming to the... Absolutely.
Thank you for giving way. And as a very proud adoptive parent, I may just say, first of all, we hear rightly a lot in this debate about the many challenges which adopted children can face, but we also need to remember the huge joy that they bring to their families and to their adoptive parents. I would just say to him, he's right to highlight the many challenges in children's social care. And would he agree with me that it's vital that this government, as they are committed to doing, gets on with a real root and branch reform of children's social care so that we get children into permanent, safe, long-term placements as soon as possible?
Alistair Stratton.
Absolutely, and I think she's, in a very heartwarming way, remind us all of the opportunity here if we can get this system right, making sure that more young people who've had deeply difficult starts in life can experience the very best of parenting and the very best of support and love that we'd all want for our own children. Now, I'm really glad that whether it's through investment and reform, this government is committed to starting to put right some of the challenges in the system we've inherited. Whether it's finally funding long overdue and very important kinship care pilots, whether it's reforming and supporting more local authorities to be able to recruit more people into foster care in their local areas, there's a lot to shout about. And I am glad, albeit with some caveats, that in the context of a very difficult financial and public services inheritance, we've been able to at least safeguard the existing funding to keep the adoption support going for the next year. However, while it is to be welcomed that it's now being accessed by many more families, there's no getting away from the fact that the changing cap will have an impact for some young people and their carers in our constituencies. And it's very understandable the concern that's now causing many of them. While I know there'll be lots of conversations going forward about how we can best bring to life our broader vision to look after young people in our care in the best possible way and to make sure we're supporting more of them into those nourishing and fantastic and thriving placements that we'd like to, in the meantime, we owe it to them to make sure we're using every available lever to provide the fullest support that's being made available. So I'd welcome thoughts about how we can do more to make sure that local authorities are using their virtual heads to hold schools accountable for the pupil premium placement money they're being given for those children in adoption and foster care placements under their watch to widen the support available to them. I'd welcome consideration where we've given local authorities more money for children's social care, how guidance can be strengthened to make sure they're filling in the gaps where we know it's likely to be in that child, that's families and all of our best interests. And going forward, I know, like many others around this room, I welcome further opportunities to work with the Minister. We've got a lot of huge champions of carers and care leavers in this Parliament. It's one of the most exciting and energising things about being an MP in this new Parliament. And I know we would all be very excited to continue to work with her to make sure we can finally bring to life the fullness of the vision of this government, to make sure that every young person, and particularly those young people who've been entrusted to all of us as a society to care for, get the best start and the best support in life that they so desperately need.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for South West Devon for bringing this vital debate. In the interest of brevity, I will say this. Firstly, I really want to applaud the work of Beacon House, who are based in Cookfield in Mid-Sussex and serve people right across the South East, including those constituents in my honourable friend, the member for Chichester's constituency as well. I went to visit them recently. They do incredible work and are incredible people. And also Jigsaw in Burgess Hill, who also support children who have been adopted. And I'd also like to thank the families in Mid-Sussex who have taken on children in a kinship care situation or have adopted them. Firstly, for taking that step, because that is an enormous commitment to make and so important, as we've heard from a number of members across the room this afternoon. But also for writing to me, because as an honourable member just said, I think for many people in this room, we don't know what it's like to be an adoptive parent or take on kinship care. I certainly didn't, and until a few months ago, I was unaware of the ASGSF and the vital provision that it offers to families who've come forward and taken on children. And I think when you're considering the work that the ASGSF provides, we need to remember that we're talking about families, and because it's families, a lot of what goes on is in private and is behind closed doors, and it's not very visible to the public. And that is why it is so important and why so many members across the room this afternoon have come here today from all parties to make the case for the ASGSF to be properly funded and properly reinstated. I would like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Twickenham, for the work that she's done in pushing this and pushing that urgent question that came the day after last year's funding expired, which then resulted in the securing of funding. And just note that actually it was during recess that those changes to the provisions of how that funding would be allocated was released, which I think we were all deeply dismayed by. And as other members have said, what this money does is it enables people to have the courage to come forward and offer to adopt and take on kinship children, and it's also preventing adoption breakdowns every single day. There is a great deal of cross-party support for getting this right, and that's why after this debate I'm going to the backbench committee to put in a bid to make sure that we get a backbench debate on this as well, because I think that's the strength of feeling that we all share here. So I've closed by urging the Minister to come back with a better answer than I suspect she's going to be able to this afternoon without wanting to prejudge where she's going to go. Thank you.
Will Stone.
Thank you, Ms Harris. From South West Devon for bringing forward this important debate. I would also like to thank the Minister for engaging with me so constructively on this important issue, and the extension of the £50 million fund that supports children in both adoptive and kinship care. This fund helped 20,000 children last year, and this support has really made a difference. I also want to I also welcome the government's commitment to the new kinship care trial, worth 40 million. This is a positive and much needed step in the right direction. It is absolutely right that our government supports as many children as possible who have been adopted and are being raised in kinship care. However, a number of constituents have raised concerns about the future of funding and how it will be delivered in practice. One first-time adopter in Swindon North wrote to me about his experience for applying for the Adoptive Support Fund. He said overall the experience was positive. However, he was concerned about the changes to the funding ceiling. Will he have to reapply? His fears are this could cause delays and his child might miss out on the vital therapy that they need at a crucial time. Can the Minister confirm whether families who previously were approved for higher levels of funding will automatically be approved under the new lower ceiling without the need to resubmit new applications? Another constituent who got in touch with me was a mother who was a special guardian for 2 children. Once again, she welcomed the Kinship Fund trial, but she expressed concerns with the scheme. Currently, no detailed information has been published. She relies on the Adoption Support Fund and is unsure what will happen when that ends. Can the Minister tell us when more information about the Kinship Fund trial will be shared, and can she confirm whether Swindon will be included in this trial area? I'm sure she won't answer that one, and we've got some competition from Dudley as well. But it'd be nice to get an answer. And finally, the Fatal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder South West team have been in touch. They are a voluntary organisation providing vital support for children suffering from the effects of FASD. These children have often experienced trauma, neglect and irreversible brain damage. Previously, they benefited from clinical pathways and multidisciplinary disciplinary assessments supported by the £2,500 premium. Now that funding is gone. The team is deeply concerned that children with FASD will no longer be adopted simply because the support is not there. Can the Minister provide clarification on the funding levels through the upcoming spending review and commit to a long-term, sustainable funding adoption support for children with FASD that must not be left behind? Thank you all.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Ms Harris. It's an honour to serve with you in the chair, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for South West Devon for securing this debate. Around 3,000 children in England are adopted each year. Most have suffered severe abuse or neglect. Earlier this year, the government left many adoptive families in limbo, failing to confirm whether the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund would continue beyond the 31st of March. This was even the case right up until the end of March. I received the following letter from my constituent, Laura Blatherwick, who is the Devon lead for the Like Minds network. She wrote, "It is now the 22nd of March and we still don't have a decision from the government on the continuation of the fund. In 9 days, the fund is due to close. New applications and top-ups to existing support take months to approve. This means that already there are families not receiving the support they desperately need. Others will have a long gap in their therapy. We are very concerned about current increases to risk and recovery disruption for some of the most vulnerable children and young people we support. As we've heard, in the end, the fund was retained, thanks in part to pressure from the Liberal Democrats and my honourable friend, the member for Twickenham, who forced an urgent question in Parliament. But 40%, a slashing of the fund available to an individual from £5,000 to £3,000. I've had contact with two organisations in Devon who are affected by these changes, the Youth Arts and Health Trust and Family Compass. Between them, these two registered charities collectively provide professional therapies for approximately 130 children per year, children who've experienced adoption. These are children who have had to have their therapy terminated mid-process, often at very risky times in their lives. I heard from the Youth Arts and Health Trust that they are dipping into their limited reserves to continue to offer therapy for free to some of these young people who are currently profoundly at risk. At a cost to this charity, they have to continue because these young people are disclosing youth homelessness and sexual abuse and exploitation. This huge reduction in funding means that much needed year-long therapy is now unaffordable through good value trusted providers, and what we're likely to see is other providers that we cannot be sure of moving in to fill the gap. This is not just a funding issue, this is a moral issue. In fact, it is a moral failure. A system that claims to protect children cannot simultaneously undermine the very services that support their recovery. Thank you.
Your chairship, and I also thank the members for South West Devon for enabling us all to speak on this today. Before I begin, I'd like to declare an interest as an adoptive parent and foster carer. That experience has shown me the transformative effect that adoption can have and the immense challenges faced by many of our children who are looked after and care experienced. When we talk about government support, let's be clear that we are talking about lifelines, not luxuries. Yeah. Around 3,000 children in England are placed in adoptive families every year, and 80% of them will have suffered from abuse, neglect or violence. So it's no wonder that they often need specialist support to help them and their families heal and live with the scars that will never fully fade. I won't speak at length on the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund, as I know that many honourable members are raising this in their speeches, but I will just say that to have its reach limited is to effectively clip the wings of our young people and families that are supported, but also those of the incredibly skilled and compassionate professionals who are working with them. However, I want to highlight that the Minister is amongst that group. I know the wealth of experience she draws on from her career as a social worker and how deeply she cares about adopters, kinship and foster carers. If she faced no financial constraints, I know the money would be out the door tomorrow, supporting every family to the absolute fullest. Yesterday, I met with Adoption UK, who stressed to me the importance of the ASGSF, but also ensuring that all healthcare and education professionals are aware of the impact of early childhood trauma and care experience so that affected children and young people can receive targeted support and advocacy services. In advance of an adjournment debate secured last month by the member for Harrogate and Knaresborough, I also spoke to the social worker supporting me and my husband with what we hope will be the adoption of our second child. She had lots of thoughts on this subject, and I'd like to mention just some that I couldn't raise in that debate. Improved holistic support within schools enabled by integrated working between schools and healthcare professionals like occupational therapists so that there's continuity of support. Closer working between psychologists and adoption teams, because having access to support within teams could actually reduce the need for families to apply to the ASGSF, and higher levels of short-term funding to allow for weekly therapeutic support, which is very difficult to obtain through the ASGSF at the moment. I don't have time to speak as much as I'd like to on kinship care, but all I'll say is that too few families receive financial or therapeutic support, but they still face those practical and emotional challenges. The route closest to my heart is fostering to adopt, the route that my husband and I took, which gives the benefits of early permanence, but without a cast iron guarantee that the placement will end in adoption. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to debate that more in the future. My point is this: whatever route into permanence, children's needs are no different. What is different is the consistency and the quality of support they receive. When we ask families to step up for vulnerable children, and they do, day in and day out, the least we can do is make sure that we step up for them. Thank you.
Jones.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Harris, and I would like to thank the Honourable Member for South West Devon for securing this very important debate. The government's cut to the Adoption and Special Guardian Support Fund are going to harm vulnerable children in my constituency of Wokingham and across England. These children and their families will see vital therapies suspended, and they do not know when or even if they will resume. One family, prior to the cuts, received 264 hours of therapy, but that will now fall to just 32 hours. Will the Minister meet with me and my local constituents to discuss the cuts to the ASGSF so that she can hear directly from those affected? And will the Minister publish the analysis upon which the changes to the ASGSF were made? And can the Minister detail the level of consultation that was undertaken with service providers and adoptive and kinship families before the cuts were announced? And finally, I would like to pay tribute to all the families who will be affected by these cuts and ask them to continue their incredible work in fighting against them. I must also thank my constituent, Claire Solomons, who has worked so hard in organising petitions, speaking in the media and being an invaluable source of advice on this issue. And I hope the Minister will listen to their experience and reverse the cuts as soon as possible. Thank you.
Rachel Gilmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for South West Devon in securing this debate. It is an oft-repeated political trope that children are our future, but it stands the test of time much better than most clichés. It is also often said that a society can be judged on how it treats its most vulnerable. I feel that the two sayings come together here as we are talking about some of the most vulnerable children in our society and the vital support networks which surround them. Children often come into these settings having experienced incredible trauma, neglect or abuse in the first months or years of their lives. The complex challenges which arise from those unthinkable but all too real experiences should be talked about more often, and we need to be doing more to highlight how we can support our fantastic adoptive and kinship care support networks, not talking about cuts to the funding which keeps them going. In the South West and across the country, thousands of children and their families are supported by funds from the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. In 2023 to 24, the South West had 129 approved applications under this fund, with nearly 1,200 for creative and physical therapies. Turning to the economy, kinship care saves the government about £4.3 billion each year. Adoption saves £4.2 billion, spread amongst local authorities, the wider economy and the NHS. Why then? The government felt it had no option but to slash the ASGS budget allocation per child. I am not sure. In conclusion, we already have a crisis in adoption, with the number of families willing to step forward to adopt plunging without the support of the ASGSF for those families who need it. That number will continue to decline and the number of children saved plummet. I call wholeheartedly on the government to reverse these harmful cuts immediately and to reaffirm its commitment to supporting vulnerable children and the families who care for them. We can be a society which cares, and we must look after those for whom we need to care so deeply.
Manuela Portegala.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for South West Devon, who has spoken so passionately for children and families. Kinship carers and adoptive families perform an extraordinary public service, providing stability, love and hope for children who have experienced trauma, loss or neglect. And I had the privilege of meeting many adopted families and family carers in my constituency of Stratford-on-Avon. Too often, they are left to navigate complex systems with little support, Over half of kinship carers say their children aren't getting the help they need in education or to access mental health, or indeed any legal advice about their rights or options. Many are forced to reduce their hours or leave work entirely, yet there is still no statutory right to paid employment leave for kinship carers. On adoption, the situation is no less troubling. Post-adoption support is patchy at best, with some families waiting 6 months just for an initial assessment. Obviously, the government has reduced now this important fund, and cuts to the ASGS fund threaten the very purpose of adoption, of the adoption system, and it might lead to adoption breakdowns. These families deserve stability, no sudden U-turns. They need clear, consistent support, no muddled promises. And above all, they need a government that stands with them, not just in words, but in action.
Hear, hear.
James McLean.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It's an honour to serve under you today, and my congratulations to the member for South West Devon for this important debate. Around 157 children in my constituency of Lewis are in kinship care. These are children not being raised by their parents, but by grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, or close friends. They step up in times of crisis, providing stable, loving homes where children cannot live with their parents. They do this not for recognition or financial reward, but out of love and a deep commitment to bringing families together. Across England, more than 132,000 children are growing up in kinship care. These are children who might otherwise be in the care system, and it's thanks to kinship carers that they are not. But this love comes at a cost that is often borne alone, as I've heard firsthand from kinship carers in my constituency. When I met with our local kinship care group in Polegate in my constituency, set up by the formidable local kinship campaigner, Wendy Turner, I listened to carers and children and heard about the challenges they face financially in particular. Unlike foster carers, most kinship carers receive little or no financial support, despite taking on exactly the same responsibilities. Recent research from Kinship and the Centre for Care reveals that kinship carers contribute over 4.3 billion to our economy, yet many struggle to make ends meet. The figures are deeply troubling. Kinship carers are twice as likely as other adults to rely on food banks. They're 4 times as likely to be behind on their bills, and 1 in 8 may be forced to make the heartbreaking decision to stop caring for the children they love, simply because they cannot afford to continue. This isn't just about fairness to carers, it's about doing the right thing by children. Because when I think of those 157 in kinship care across Lewis, Seaford, Newhaven, Polegate and our local villages, I see 157 reasons we must do better. I've written to the Chancellor urging investment in kinship care to be prioritised in the upcoming review. The message from my constituents is clear. These families have stepped up for children when it mattered most. Now it's time for us to step up for them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Lib Dem spokesperson Manura Wilson.
Thank you very much, Ms Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And can I start by congratulating the Honourable Member for South West Devon for securing this extremely important debate. And I know that this is an issue that she and I are both passionate about and she cares about deeply. Could I just start by reminding colleagues, as many have already done, about who these children are that we're talking about today. These children who have experienced the kind of trauma that none of us should ever have to experience in our life. After I first brought up the issue of the Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund with the Prime Minister in March, a lady from Lincolnshire wrote to me, who is a special guardian for a child who witnessed her mother being murdered by her father at the age of 2. And that child doesn't qualify for child and adolescent mental health support for some reason and has only been able to access a limited amount of counselling. That's the sort of child the ASGSF is for. These are also children who've been abused and neglected. When I spoke to Purple Elephant, a therapy provider in Twickenham, Jenny, the CEO who's worked with adopted children for many years, talked to me about children she'd worked with who'd been made to sleep in the garden, who'd ingested heroin. These are the sorts of experiences these children have been through. They need our collective help and support to overcome that trauma, and the amazing people who step up to care for them, whether that's through adoption or often as kinship carers overnight, need our collective support. As one adoptive parent in my constituency said to me, she said, these children
deserve the absolute best second chance in life. And so I implore the Minister today, who I know has a professional background in this area and does care about this deeply, to please listen to the pleas from all benches about the support desperately needed. Just before I talk in a bit more detail about the ASGSF, just a couple of words on kinship carers, given that I have been proud to campaign alongside my party for kinship carers for a number of years now. I want to welcome the limited progress we have seen under both the previous and this government in supporting and recognising kinship carers. As the Honourable Member for Easington said, we have to go much further. We've got to roll out allowances on a par with foster carers' allowances across the country to all kinship carers. We've got to extend employment leave to kinship carers, and we have to ensure that children in kinship care are given the support they need in education through Pupil Premium Plus and priority school admission. And for adoptive parents, as my honourable friend, the member for Harrogate, said in a recent debate, they make a lifelong commitment to these children. And as we've heard from the member for Cannock Chase, who's also adopted himself, there is a lot more support the state needs to give them. One constituent said to me, the ASGSF is actually the only post-adoption support there is for these children. So that brings me to the ASGSF. Ms Harris, I can't begin to describe my anger and dismay at what has happened, and I will try and contain that emotion as I speak today, because the stories that are being sent to me, that I hear face to face as I have been working on this issue in recent weeks and months, have on a number of occasions moved me to tears. The months of uncertainty that these families faced when the government refused, when the minister sitting opposite had to answer a litany of written questions and letters from members across the House, from all parties across the House, as to whether the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund would continue for this financial year. They were stonewalled. Now, these are children, as I've explained in terms of the trauma they've experienced, who have had a huge amount of uncertainty and instability in their lives, and yet here the government was adding to that instability. We were all stonewalled. And it required me, the day after the fund expired, to drag that minister kicking and screaming to the House of Commons chamber to answer an urgent question when she finally committed to renewing the fund for this financial year. Now, there was a sigh of relief amongst carers, adoptive parents and kinship carers, and indeed charities across the sector, that uncertainty had ended despite the backlog that had built up in the meantime and the interruption in therapy for so many children they'd run out of money in last year's fund and they'd had to stop. But there was no hint from the minister during her response to my urgent question about the cuts that were to come. Instead, the government waited till the depths of the Easter recess to sneak out a private letter to local authorities and charities about the 40% cuts to the grants, about the removal of the assessment grant, to scrap the match funding in this fund. And to quote a adoptive mother that I met at the drop-in organised by Adoption UK and Kinship yesterday, she said to me, this felt very underhand, and it felt like the government didn't care as I was dealing with my adoptive son who was dysregulated and trying to hurt me. There was no consultation with the sector, despite the fact that the government has these reference groups, like the Kinship reference group that they talk to on a regular basis. No consultation with them. No formal public announcement. Even the website, the government website on the ASGSF, remained out of date for several weeks afterwards, until our first day back after recess, when a fairly scant written ministerial statement was issued by the minister. So my first question to the minister is, when she answered my urgent question on the 1st of April, was she aware these cuts were coming? Or did she inadvertently mislead the House on that occasion? Now, the impact, Ms Harris, of these changes to the ASGSF means we've got a backlog, and everybody who had previously applied, in fact, some 46% of grants that have been applied for this financial year go above the 3,000 limit. They've all got to reapply again. So there's now going to be a delay, an interruption in therapy. The mum I met yesterday said to me she's borrowing money from friends and family to continue therapy because in her son's last therapy session, she finally got a breakthrough and she couldn't bear to stop that therapy given the breakthrough they had just achieved. Purple Elephant in Twickenham is desperately fundraising to try and make sure that there isn't an interruption in therapy for the 40 or so children that they support. With the smaller grants, we know that these providers are going to struggle to provide adequate therapy. Given the sorts of trauma we've talked about, these children, their brains need rewiring. They need time to build trust. Often therapists have to run several sessions before a child will even come through the door. That takes time. That's not going to be done in a few short sessions that these grants will cover. And given that the assessment costs are now going to have to come out of the reduced £3,000 grant, when a bespoke assessment is done, that's going to leave very little, if anything at all, for the actual therapy. And so, as well as the impact on the children and their carers who are desperately trying to look after them, this is really going to undermine and destabilise the charities and other providers who are providing this support. As many other honourable members have said, we're talking about children who will be dysregulated, exhibit challenging behaviours. It will lead to adoption and kinship care placement breakdown, which will result in extra costs on the taxpayer in terms of more children going back into care. We'll probably see more school exclusions as a result of these dysregulated behaviours, therefore poorer education outcomes, poorer employment outcomes, and sadly, care-experienced children are 4 times more likely to end up with a criminal conviction by the age of 24. Madam Chair, the cost to the taxpayer in the short and the long term are exorbitant, yet this fund is actually, it's only £50 million. It's actually, in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount of money. And therefore, if the government wants to extend that fund, say by 50%, I can tell the Minister exactly where she can get that money from. Whereas when in her written ministerial statement she was suggesting local authorities, children's budgets can top this up, I'm not sure if she's aware, but a lot of local authorities are on the brink financially, and children's services, many of them are in huge deficit. Where she can find the money is the £46.5 million the Department for Education spent on advertising, consultancy and marketing costs in the last year. That amount is almost equal to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. So could I suggest to her that she halves that consultancy and advertising budget and instead expands the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund by 50%? Yeah. Madam Chair, these cuts are entirely incoherent and contradictory to government policy. The DfE has recently written to Adoption England calling for improvements in adoptive recruitment. The Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill mandates signposting of support, yet all of these things will go against that. So I will bring my remarks to a conclusion. I have 3 asks of the Minister. Please apologise to carers and children up and down the country. Reverse these cuts. I've told her where to get the money. And please fight tooth and nail in the Treasury for the spending review for the next financial year and make that announcement early, because carers and children will continue to campaign, and I will...
Shadow Minister Gregory Stafford.
Thank you very much, Ms Harris, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I want to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for South West Devon, for securing such an important debate. Keen observers of Westminster Hall debates will notice that my honourable friend responded on behalf of His Majesty's Government to my debate this morning, so there is a nice symmetry to the fact that I'm responding to hers. And she gave an excellent summary of the current system and the impact that the changes that happened overnight will have on adopters, carers and, of course, on the children that they support. Honourable members across this chamber have powerfully demonstrated the impact that this is having on their constituents, and my seat of Farnham, Borden, Hazelmere, Liphook and its surrounding villages is no different. Honourable members will forgive me that because so many spoke I won't be able to talk about all, but I do want to pay special tribute to those members who expressed their personal experiences in this matter. Firstly, I want to note the strong record of the previous Conservative government in supporting kinship carers, adoptive families and some of the most vulnerable children in our society. Whilst others have made promises, we took action. But there is no doubt there is more to do, which is why I welcome today's debate. The Conservatives, I believe, hold a strong record for prioritising and increasing adoption and strengthening kinship policy making, for example, by introducing the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. This fund provided financial support to local authorities and regional adoption agencies to pay for essential therapeutic services for the most vulnerable children. However, the government's decision to cut this fund was a retrograde step and places significant stress on the near 17,000 applicants who, in 2023-2024 alone, utilised services such as family therapy, parental training and creative therapeutic intervention. Furthermore, it is highly regrettable that the government failed to provide clarity on the continuation of the support fund before its expiry on the 31st of March this year. And despite repeated calls for assurance, including from practitioners and sector leaders, Labour delayed their announcement. And when it finally came, as the Honourable Member for York Central stated, it confirmed a 40% reduction in the fair access limit, capping support at £3,000 per child per year, compared to the £5,000 families could access previously. This reduction now places pressure on local authorities to bridge a shortfall of almost £34 million using already stretched children's services budgets. The Minister has previously stated that the additional support can be provided above the cap, but only at the discretion and at the financial behest of local councils. And as honourable members have said, many local authorities are not in the position to do so. Even if they are in a position to do so, this approach risks creating a postcode lottery in support for some of the most vulnerable children and leaving out others. I'm very happy to.
Joe Robinson.
And as one of the vice chairs of the APPG on kinship care, along with the honourable member for Twickenham, I'd just like to add my voice to those calling for a reversal of the cuts, but for the government to actually go further than that and better support families in adoption and in kinship care.
Shadow Minister Stafford.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for the Isle of Wight East. I know what a doughty champion he is for this cause, and I entirely agree with him. The government needs to set out precisely what it's going to do going forward, as well as reversing the cut that it made. So I would like to use the opportunity to seek clarification on what the Minister's adoption strategy is outside of the delayed and unfair cuts she has made so far for these children. We know that in 2024 there are nearly 3,000 looked after children who were adopted. So putting aside the fund that we've been talking about, how is the Minister going to support these vulnerable children? While the continuation of essential schemes remained, let's say, grey under this government, adoptive families now cite a lack of support as a key barrier. Without essential support, the whole adoption process risks becoming what former MP and Children's Minister Tim Lawton called a false economy. Because the truth is, when we fail to invest in adoption, especially in kinship care, we end up relying more heavily on a state system that, in the long run, costs more and too often fails children. It leaves them more vulnerable to poor outcomes, including higher risks of criminal involvement and limited aspirations. Adoption, when done right, offers the security, stability and sense of belonging that every child deserves, and we should support it accordingly. Likewise, the deeply flawed Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill represents a major failure for kinship carers. The lack of statutory obligations and concerns about the sufficiency of financial support highlights the need for continued advocacy and potential further legislative action to ensure kinship carers and the children they support receive comprehensive support. These carers typically receive little financial or emotional support, despite playing a vital role in keeping children out of the formal care system. These often unsung heroes deserve better. And that's why the previous government introduced the Social Impact Bond, SIB model, an innovative funding approach that backed targeted projects to support kinship families. These included initiatives like training and guidance for carers, family group conferencing, where social workers bring family and carers around the table to discuss the most viable options for the long term, and other structured efforts are undertaken to prevent the breakdown of kinship placement, which, if unsupported, can push children into the care system. One notable example is the Kinship Connected Bill, funded by private investment. It not only aimed to relieve pressure on local authorities, but more importantly, to enhance stability and well-being for the children at the heart of these families through rehoming children with their grandparents when the immediate family had broken down, ensuring siblings remain together and receive consistent supportive care within their extended family network. This approach prioritised emotional continuity and minimised the trauma often associated with foster care placements. Both kinship care and adoption offer vital, human-centred alternatives to the traditional care system, yet too often these pathways are undervalued. To truly serve the best interests of children, we must ask local authorities and ensure that they are supported and broaden our strategy to actively support and invest in family-based solutions that exist beyond the boundaries of state control. Ms Harris, the Minister has been widely praised by members on the government side this afternoon. This is the time to live up to that reputation. Therefore, I would like to close my remarks with 4 questions to the Minister. How is the Government working with local authorities to ensure they are able to provide the best care available for vulnerable children, especially following the cut to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Fund? Second, and similarly, what steps will the Minister take to ensure sustained and equitable support for kinship carers, particularly in light of cuts to that fund and the absence of statutory obligations in current legislation? 3. How are the Government ensuring that private capital is not isolated by their state-focused strategy to ensure that as much investment can be awarded to worthy schemes for kinship care? And finally, how is the Government extending the family group conferencing to ensure that children are kept within the family unit where they can be safe and happy for as long as possible? Ms Harris, I agree with the Honourable Member for Redditch. I will take up my pitchfork too and go to the Treasury to get this funding. We have a duty of care to these children. We need to support adopters and carers, for if not, the financial cost will be great, but the human cost will be far greater.
Minister Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I really recognise across this chamber that there are many champions here for children and families, and indeed there are many passionate members that really do want the right outcomes for children that are adopted and that are in kinship care through special guardianship, care arrangements orders and others. But I want to begin by thanking the Honourable Member for South West Devon on securing this important debate, and I share her commitment to wanting the best support for adoptive and kinship children, and indeed acknowledge her sincere interest in this area. Now, there have been many interventions, been many questions of me, and there have been many speeches, and in the time given, I will not refer to each member by their constituency. I will do my best to endeavour to respond to the many questions that have indeed rightly so been put. Now, we recognise the particular needs of adopted and kinship children, many who have experienced trauma, and some will have experienced utero damage resulting in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and indeed other conditions. And this is why this government has continued to provide funding for support for these children through the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund and indeed in other ways. I want to begin by saying that there have been no cuts in the overall budget to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund. The announcement was made, and when that announcement was made, I did indeed say that further information would follow. Now, the announcement was further made during recess so that the Adoption Special Guardianship Fund could be opened and that therapy could be accessed. And we had to announce that so that the new criteria was available and that the funding could indeed be open. Although funding has been confirmed at 50 million this year, we know it will not be enough to meet expected demand, and we are therefore making these decisions now to enable us to support the maximum number of children. Families will still receive a good standard of support through the fund, 3,000 worth of therapy each year, substantial amount of support, and will fund an average of 19 to 20 hours of therapy on current costings. And where needed, local authorities and regional adoption agencies can use their own funding to increase the amount of therapy if this is needed. Indeed, the assessments as well will also be able to continue, whether that is the multidisciplinary assessments or specialist assessments, but that would be derived from that 3,000. Now, we have decided to stop match funding and the separate funding of specialist assessments, but as I've said, that would indeed can still continue out of that 3,000. I'll give way here first.
I thank the Minister for giving way and my honourable friend for letting me get there first. The point I would make is in the adjournment debate that I held and the Minister was responding, she made the point, and I quote, "Support for adopted children is critical and it can decrease the likelihood of adoption, disruption or breakdown. In real terms to people on the ground, this is a cut." So will she acknowledge the actions of her government are going to have an impact on adoption, breakdown and disruption?
I absolutely recognise that the threshold and criteria has changed, and that has changed to enable us to ensure that we're able to reach as many children under this current funding of 50 million. I absolutely recognise it is crucial for assessments to continue for these children to enable them to have the right types of therapy. If members will allow me to press on, I'll be able to respond a bit further because there were many things that were absolutely raised. So if I turn now to the adoption and special guardianship not being available to all children living under special guardianship orders. The main reason the fund is only available to previously looked after children living under special guardianship or child arrangements order is that those previously looked after children, such as those who have been in foster care or residential care, may face higher levels of vulnerability and disadvantage compared to their peers. These funds aim to provide targeted support to address the specific challenges associated with their prior experiences. Now, moving to there has been many questions also around the Kinship pilot and the Kinship funding, but I just want to obviously say furthermore about the special guardianship and support fund. Now, on the 14th of April, the Department announced that the fund would be open to applications with changed criteria, the fair access limit to 3,000 per child per year, stopping match funding and enabling the separate funding of specialist assessments. And where it is assessed as being needed, as I have already said, families can approach their local authorities and can approach their regional adoption agencies. And Adoption England is also obviously working with these regional adoption agencies. And the regional adoption agencies are also looking into, well, we also have specialist excellent centres, which is a multidisciplinary approach to enabling that there is different types but essential provision that adoptive children absolutely need. I will give them.
Alison Bennett.
What is the Minister's assessment of the level of reserves that local authorities and adoption agencies have available in order to boost that funding?
Here.
So we have invested a further 8.8 million for Adoption England, and 5 million of that will be towards the services of excellence. In terms of local authorities, members will be aware of the Children and Wellbeing and Schools Bill, and will also be aware that we are investing in the early prevention and intervention work in local authorities. And in doing so, we are trying to make sure that we support families through the kinship arrangements. And as members are also aware, we have already committed 40 million to a pilot for kinship care. And yeah, give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. The bottom line, however, is that we know that there's insufficiency for very specific therapeutic interventions for these young people. And therefore, as a result of today's debate, will she commit to the Chamber now that she will go back to Treasury and make the case to ensure there's sufficiency for full funding of therapeutic interventions so no child misses out?
So we are in challenging situations as a government. But we are continuing to make sure that we're making sure that there's provision in place for adopted children and kinship children, and we will always make sure that there are certain provisions in place, and that we will continue to look at different types of therapy that needs to be in place. And in response, that I will continue to have conversations with Treasury about the essential funding that is needed, and in particular in this area as well. I'm very conscious of time and the response as well, but in terms of the 40 million package to trial a new kinship allowance for kinship carers, I have heard that honourable members across the chamber that have put in bids, obviously, for their local authorities. But I would like to say that we will be looking at making sure that there is an expression of interest, a call to all local authorities. And this will be launched this summer to identify which local authorities will be best placed to deliver the pilot from the autumn this year. And unfortunately, I cannot guarantee to those local authorities that have already put in bids to me with regards to that. Now, adopted children and in kinship care should be supported to obtain good educational outcomes. However, many do not do so, with poorer GCSE results than the overall population and higher exclusion rates. Adopted children entitled to priority school admissions, plus advice and support from designated teachers. Schools also receive £2,630 in pupil premium plus funding for every adopted child in their school. Both adopted and kinship children can receive advice and support from local authority virtual school heads, and we will fully update the statutory guidance for virtual school heads, including sections on supporting educational outcomes. Now, through the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, we are seeking to mandate local authorities to appoint at least one person to promote the educational achievement of children who live in kinship care, regardless of whether they've been in local authority care or not. These duties will ensure they receive consistent support to improve their outcomes. Now, there's actually much more to be said on all of this, and obviously very much in responding to your questions. But I am grateful to all of the honourable members for raising the important subject of adoption and support today, and for initiating such a thoughtful and wide-ranging debate. There are many things that I will obviously take away from what has come out of this debate, but I do want to say that in terms of the match funding for the assessments that has come out of your questions, the previous match funding applications accounted for less than 2% of all applications in the last financial year. I just thought that's important just to put that within the wider context. There was wide disparity over this in the country with regard to this match funding. But as I've already said, there are other avenues in which adoptive parents and carers can go to be able to ensure that they can continue to get that additional support that they need for their children. I've listened carefully to remarks of honourable members and honourable friends, and I know that many outside of this House will be very keen to follow up on what has been said, and I'm sure, as one of the honourable members already said, in terms of putting in for a backbench business debate, there will be other opportunities to further question myself and this government on these issues. And honourable members, I'm sure, agree that the biggest tribute very much goes to the parents and carers of adopted and kinship children. And one of my honourable friends has already mentioned, that, which has not been mentioned before, apart from when she mentioned it, the joy that adoptive children and kinship children bring to their families, and I just want to acknowledge that, and I want to thank all of those parents and carers who continue to demonstrate compassion, resilience and dedication. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Rebecca Smith to wind up. Very short.
Thank you, Chair. You heard earlier
the role of a corporate parent, and I didn't quite make it into my speech, I ran out of time, but I feel that although that might be a local authority responsibility, it's clear that today there are many who take the same approach as parliamentarians. Honourable members have highlighted the opportunity that we have to provide the best possible outcome for children in adoption, kinship and foster care, but also the need for significant commitment to ensure the specialist resources that are required to deliver on their potential, and a certainty for families. Now, I think everyone in this chamber will agree that we have not heard that certainty today, and I believe that we are all going to be working incredibly hard to keep pressing the Minister, but it sounds like also the Chancellor, to make sure that we get the funding that is required for these vulnerable families, and no doubt we will all see each other, I hope, in the main chamber to discuss this further.
Is that this House has considered government support for children in adoptive and kinship placements? As many of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Can I ask colleagues to leave swiftly, please, for the next debate to start?